Did you just say the American people are too stupid to understand policy? The words hung in the air like a slap. Cameras froze, producers leaned forward in their booths, and even the floor manager stopped mid-gesture. It wasn't just the audacity of the question, it was who it was directed at. Donald Trump, seated across from the host of one of MSNBC's most popular primetime shows, didn't react immediately. He didn't need to, because every person in that studio, and millions more watching from home, felt it. Something had just shifted. The host, a man long praised by progressive media circles for his tough interviews and no-nonsense attitude, clearly thought he had landed a viral blow. He reclined in his chair, cocky and careless, giving that signature half-smile that usually precedes a flurry of retweets and praise from Twitter's echo chambers. But this wasn't the typical guest, and this wasn't the typical night. Trump leaned forward, placing both hands on the edge of the desk. The light above caught the edge of his cufflinks. His eyes didn't waver. He didn't raise his voice. But when he finally spoke, the tone was unmistakable, measured, steady, and cold as steel. "No," he said. "You said that." The host blinked, lips parting slightly, as if trying to recall whether he had. The clip would later show he had, just 5 minutes earlier, during a heated back and forth on tax policy. He'd thrown out the line like a joke, laughing to himself. "Most Americans wouldn't even get it if we explained the budget. They're not policy experts." And maybe he didn't think anyone would remember, but Trump did. And now he had just cracked open a very public mistake. The live chat online exploded. He just got caught lying. Trump's about to bury him. And in the studio, the audience, previously stacked with network staffers and guests who usually ate out of the host's hand, grew uncomfortably quiet. "I think the American people understand a lot more than you think," Trump continued, his tone tightening. "In fact, I think they're smart enough to see through someone who talks down to them while pretending to speak for them." The host shifted, trying to cut in. "With all due respect..." But Trump wasn't finished. "No, let's talk about respect," he said, pointing slightly. "You sit there, with your salary, your makeup crew, your cue cards, telling working-class families what's too complicated for them to understand. You ever waited in line at a food bank? You ever had to choose between insulin and rent? Because the people who live that life, they do understand. They understand exactly what happens when elites make decisions for them, without ever listening to them." And just like that, the audience shifted again, not with applause, not yet, but with focus. The host was no longer leading, he was being led. And he knew it. But Trump was just warming up. The host tried to recover, tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground. "Well, if we're going to get personal," he started, forcing a smile, adjusting the papers in front of him as if facts printed on cardstock could shield him from what was coming next. But Trump didn't flinch. "Oh, this isn't personal," he said. "This is about trust, and the American people stopped trusting people like you a long time ago." The studio lights felt hotter now. The crew in the control room watched in silence as their host, the man who usually commanded the stage, began to visibly shrink beneath the pressure of a guest who didn't play by the rules of television decorum, but did know exactly how to dominate a conversation, especially one based on truth. "I've sat across from politicians, CEOs, generals," the host said, trying to reclaim his voice. "But you think you're above being questioned." Trump tilted his head slightly. "No, I just don't believe the questions you're asking are the ones that matter." A pause. "Why don't you ask about why working-class wages stagnated while cable news executives gave themselves bonuses? Why don't you talk about how networks spent 3 years pushing conspiracy stories while ignoring the fentanyl crisis? You want to talk policy? Let's talk policy. Let's talk about what you never cover, because it doesn't sell ads." It wasn't loud. It wasn't even angry. But it hit harder than any insult. The host glanced off camera. Somewhere, a producer was no doubt waving frantically, signaling for a commercial break. But Trump wasn't letting up. Every time you paint ordinary Americans as uneducated or misinformed, you're not just wrong, you're dangerous. Because a democracy doesn't die when voters make bad choices. It dies when the people in charge decide voters aren't worth listening to. The audience, silent, not bored, not disengaged, just stunned, because this was no longer a political interview. It was an autopsy, and the media's credibility was on the table, and Trump had the scalpel in his hand. But he wasn't done, not even close. The host leaned forward now, desperate to regain control of the segment. His tone sharpened. So are you saying the media is the enemy? That journalists are somehow responsible for America's problems? Trump didn't even blink. I'm saying that when the media forgets who they serve, they stop being journalists, he said evenly. They become gatekeepers, editors of the truth. The host tried to cut in, but Trump raised a hand, not to silence, but to clarify. There are real journalists, he continued, on the ground, in war zones, in small-town newsrooms, writing about opioid overdoses and broken schools. This, he said, gesturing around the studio, is not that. The camera stayed tight on Trump's face, calm, focused. And for the first time, it wasn't him who looked defensive. It was the man across from him, the professional communicator suddenly grasping for footing. You came in here for a headline, Trump added. You're gonna get one, but it's not the one you wanted. And then he leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to force every ear in the room to lean in. You wanted to embarrass me on national television, he said. But now, millions of people are watching you dodge the questions that actually matter. That's not journalism. That's theater. And you're not the director anymore. The host swallowed. His next question was loaded on the teleprompter, but suddenly it felt irrelevant. Weak, because Trump had already rewritten the script. And somewhere in the control room, a decision was being made. Cut to commercial or let it burn. But they didn't cut. The control room, usually a well-oiled machine, hesitated. Maybe it was the shock of the moment. Maybe it was the realization that cutting away would only make things worse. Whatever the reason, the feed stayed live. And so did the silence. The host shuffled his notes, stalling. His smile, once confident, had twisted into something else. Nervous, tense. He cleared his throat. Well, Mr. President, if this is about the truth, let's talk facts. You've been accused. Trump didn't let him finish. Accused by who? He interrupted. Anonymous sources? Editorial boards who haven't left Manhattan in 10 years? People who think patriotism is a costume you put on for the 4th of July, then mock behind closed doors. The host flinched. And let's be very clear, Trump went on, his voice firmer now, no longer conversational. This isn't just about me. You've mocked millions of Americans. You've called them backwards, uneducated, dangerous, just because they don't bow to your narrative, just because they dare to think differently. A camera operator shifted uncomfortably. You think mocking their faith, their jobs, their values is journalism? Trump asked. That's why they don't trust you. That's why they cheer when I call you fake news, because you've earned it. The host tried to smile again, but this time it faltered mid-lip. He was sweating now, not because of the lights, but because he could feel it. He'd lost control of the room, the story, the moment. Trump leaned back slightly, letting the silence stretch. And then, with surgical calm, he said, You wanted a circus. You forgot I own the tent. The feed was still live. The ratings were spiking, and the story was no longer the one the network had written. The fallout began before the cameras even stopped rolling. Back in the network's executive suite, phones were already lighting up. Senior producers barked half-sentences into headsets. Get legal on the line. Is this going viral already? Where's the control room feed? They didn't need confirmation. They knew what had just happened. Trump hadn't walked into an ambush. He had flipped the entire narrative in under 5 minutes, and now they were the ones on the defensive. On social media, the explosion was instant. Clips of Trump's verbal counterstrike were everywhere. No hashtags, no spin, just raw footage. A 10-second clip of him saying, You wanted a circus. You forgot I own the tent, racked up millions of views in an hour. Even accounts that normally ridiculed him hesitated. There was something about the delivery, controlled, unshaken, almost surgical, that made it hard to mock. Behind the scenes, the CNN host was pacing the hallway just outside the studio, trying to compose himself. His usual post-interview grin was gone. A production assistant offered him a bottle of water. He waved it off. In the green room, a junior staffer pulled out his phone. He didn't raise his voice once, he muttered. That's what's scariest. He didn't even try to be dramatic. Someone else replied, because he didn't need to. He came in knowing exactly what he was going to do. And that was the part that stunned everyone. Not just what Trump had said, but how prepared he had been. They expected a rant. They got a dismantling. Meanwhile, Trump wasn't waiting around. He left the studio calmly, surrounded by just one aide and a wall of silence. No gloating, no press statement, just a few words to the security guard as he passed the exit. You might want to clip that one. By that evening, it was already being called the chair flip. Not because Trump flipped a chair, but because figuratively, he had flipped the power dynamic right on its head. A host trying to score points had just become the punchline of his own show, and the next 24 hours would only make it worse. By the next morning, it wasn't just a trending moment. It was a full-blown media reckoning. Major outlets scrambled to respond. Some ignored the segment entirely, pretending it hadn't happened. Others attempted damage control, editing the clip down to dilute the impact, cutting out Trump's sharpest lines, and reframing the narrative. Trump deflects with familiar talking points. But it was too late. The internet had already archived the uncut version, and no algorithm could bury it now. The backlash wasn't just online. Inside the CNN newsroom, senior staff were holding emergency meetings. The host, once considered untouchable, was now being whispered about in editorial rooms. A memo had quietly circulated that morning. Please review all future interview prep procedures for high-risk political guests. Translation: don't underestimate anyone again, especially not him. Elsewhere, something more unexpected was happening. Critics, longtime adversaries of Trump, were silent. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they had no defense. He hadn't gone off script, hadn't melted down, hadn't tossed insults. He'd done what they had never expected. He'd exposed the performance, and viewers noticed. A viral TikTok showed two Gen Z creators reacting live to the interview, jaws slack, eyes wide. Yo, did he just quote the Constitution and mean it? One of them asked. The comment section blew up. I don't even like the guy, but that was clean. This wasn't a win. This was a masterclass. That host got cooked without heat. Even more surprising? Moderates were rewatching it. In diners across Pennsylvania, barbershops in Michigan, and coffee shops in Nevada, people were replaying the moment on loop. Not because they were fans, but because it was undeniably compelling. The way he turned the ambush into an indictment of media integrity, without shouting, without stammering, without blinking, it made people rethink what they thought they knew. And behind it all, Trump was silent. No tweets, no truth social blasts, no follow-up rallies, just silence, because sometimes the smartest move isn't to extend the story, it's to let it echo. And this time, the echo was growing louder by the hour. By midweek, the segment had reached Capitol Hill, and that's when everything shifted from viral moment to political earthquake. Senators who typically distanced themselves from Trump were now referencing the interview during committee hearings. One conservative senator held up a transcript and asked bluntly, if a journalist can't let someone finish a sentence without editorializing, is it still journalism? Another congresswoman, usually silent on media matters, tweeted, this is why Americans don't trust mainstream networks. Trump didn't dodge the question, he dismantled the stage. But the most shocking ripple came from inside the network itself. A former CNN producer, now a media consultant, published a blistering op-ed titled, We Forgot the Rules, Why Trump's Interview Wasn't the Problem. We Were. In it, She detailed how producers deliberately structured segments to create conflict, not clarity. She didn't defend Trump. She didn't need to. The point was bigger. You can't call someone a threat to democracy and then mute their answers. It hit like a gut punch. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't about Trump at all. It was about them, the gatekeepers, the institutions, the cameras, the scripts, the earpieces feeding lines to anchors mid-interview. A truth no one wanted to say out loud had just become unignorable. The game had been rigged, and for once, someone had called it live on air. And he'd done it with their own tools, not slogans, not applause lines, just clarity. Footage from the interview was now being analyzed in journalism schools. Professors who had spent semesters dissecting political media were telling their students, "Watch this clip, not because of the man, but because of what it reveals." And then came the internal leak. A producer forwarded an internal message thread to a blogger. In it, a senior executive at the network referred to the Trump segment as a reputational disaster and asked, "How do we keep control of the narrative when the guest hijacks the format?" It wasn't a question. It was a confession. Trump hadn't just disrupted their segment. He had exposed their blueprint. The phrase, "hijack the format," became a rallying cry. Not just for Trump supporters, but for anyone, left or right, who had ever watched a news segment and felt something was off. People began reposting clips of past interviews, rewatching them with new eyes. Questions that once seemed paranoid now felt relevant. Who chooses the questions? Who edits the footage? What gets left out? And suddenly, the Trump interview wasn't just a moment. It was a mirror. Cable news networks scrambled. Editorial meetings grew tense. One veteran anchor, caught on a hot mic during a commercial break, muttered, "We handed him the mic, and he handed us a warning." And it didn't stop there. Late-night shows tried to mock the situation, but the laughter felt hollow. Online, even comedians who usually took shots at Trump hesitated. They knew what they'd seen. Not a man raving or ranting, but a man, calmly and methodically, breaking down a media machine while it was still running. Meanwhile, the host at the center of it all, who had smugly interrupted, redirected, tried to trap, disappeared for 3 days. The network claimed it was a scheduled vacation. No one bought it. When she returned, her tone was different, less smirking, more scripted, and noticeably defensive. She opened her show with a somber monologue about journalistic responsibility, but by then it was too late. The shift had already begun. What Trump had done wasn't just push back, it was reframe. He reframed the narrative, the format, and most importantly, the role of the viewer. No longer passive, no longer trusting by default. Now watching with one eyebrow raised, one hand hovering over the mute button. And it wasn't because they suddenly believed every word he said. It was because, for the first time in a long time, they saw something real. A flawed man, yes, but a man who had walked into the lion's den, read the script backwards, and lit it on fire. With facts, with timing, with unnerving calm. The final punch. It didn't come from Trump himself. It came from a 30-second montage that went viral days later. It showed every time the host tried to interrupt, and every time Trump waited, then answered anyway. The caption read, "If this is how they treat the loudest man in the country, imagine how they treat the quiet ones." And just like that, the real story emerged. Not about Trump, not about CNN, about trust. And what happens when the people realize they never really had it in the first place? In the end, it wasn't the questions that exposed the truth. It was the silence between them. Trump didn't shout. He didn't storm out. He just sat there and dismantled their script, one calm sentence at a time. The host blinked. The control room panicked. The audience watched, stunned. And when the interview ended, there was no applause, no wrap-up banter, just a chilling realization. If they can twist him, live and unedited, what have they been doing to everyone else? That night, millions didn't just turn off the news. They woke up.